Good afternoon and welcome to this web panel discussion of Russian protests and American interests. I'm George Beebe. I'm Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. And I'm happy that we have an illustrious panel of experts with us today. Jill Dougherty is a fellow at the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a longtime expert on Russia and former CNN bureau chief in Moscow. Robert Legvold is perhaps America's foremost expert on Russia. He is the Marshall D. Shulman Professor Emeritus at Columbia University. And Konstantin Remchukov is the owner and editor-in-chief of Nezavisima Gazeta in Russia and one of Russia's most influential media voices. So I'm very grateful that they're all here with us today. I'd like to start out the discussion today by framing a little bit the situation and asking our panelists to comment on what we know and what we don't know about the Navalny situation. The struggle between the Kremlin and Aleksey Navalny has gone back many, many years and largely focuses on his investigations of high-level corruption in Russia and his efforts to rally popular opposition to Putin's rule. But this long-running struggle really entered a new chapter this past summer when Navalny was poisoned inside Russia, flown on an emergency basis to Germany, where he underwent treatment. And it turned out that German doctors determined that he had been poisoned with Novichok, an exotic chemical nerve agent. He immediately blamed this poisoning on Putin and then recovered from the poisoning and returned to Russia on a flight from Germany, whereupon he was immediately arrested by Russian authorities. Then yesterday, a Moscow city court convicted him of embezzlement and sentenced him to almost 3 years in a penal colony. So what I'd like to ask the panelists is, how can we as observers navigate between the claims and the counterclaims that are going back and forth between Navalny and the Kremlin? Navalny claims that Putin ordered him killed with this nerve agent, and the Kremlin asks, why would it have allowed him to be flown to a German hospital if it wanted him dead? Navalny posts a viral video on YouTube, more than 100 million views, claiming that Putin secretly owns a lavish palace on the Black Sea coast that's been purchased essentially with corrupt funds. The Kremlin counters by saying, A, Putin doesn't own it, and B, it shows videos that seem to indicate that this supposed palace is little more than an unfinished concrete shell. Navalny claims he's a Russian patriot. The Kremlin accuses him of working for foreign intelligence services to overthrow the Russian government. So this is not an easy thing to navigate. And I guess I would ask, if truth is the first casualty of war, is that also true about information warfare? How can we sort out these claims and counterclaims going back and forth here on this? Bob, could you start?
Well, I think how one sorts it out definitively is virtually impossible. We're really subject to what kind of information we have in public. We have those of us on the outside, probably even our own intelligence agencies have really limited access to what is objectively the truth. I don't think there's any question. I think even in the minds of most Russian observers that there is a very high degree of corruption within the Russian system, and that's what has been the basis for Navalny's efforts, movement within Russia. Transparency International rates Russia as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And there has been a long-term process going back to the Yeltsin years of what might be called privatizing government positions for individual advantage. So the issue of corruption, I don't think, is really the problem. Whether the specific instances of corruption that Navalny has claimed, whether it was the earlier study of Medvedev's supposed palatial estate, or whether it is this recent story of Putin's palace, there are all kinds of other sources of information and illustrations of the extraordinarily wealth of Russian politicians and leaders, including Putin, that Navalny and others have provided. So I don't think that's the issue. The question of whether or not the government, including Putin himself, was responsible for the attempt to murder Navalny, that's hard to sort out, except if one can verify the phone call that Navalny conducted with one of the GRU agents, which more or less told the story of official, that is GRU agents who did the poisoning. And if that phone call, with the way in which you verify voices and so on, is accurate, then at least it was done at an official level, whether it was under the authorization of Putin or not. And that goes back to the earlier story about the British case with the former Russian agent Skripal and the poisoning there. Again, it was clearly done by GRU agents, and the claim was that it was authorized by Putin himself. And that's where we do not have definitive evidence.
Jill, any thoughts on this?
You know, if you zero in on why now, I think that's what I've been thinking about a lot, because obviously Navalny has been around for quite a long time. He's been saying many of the same things about corruption going back several years. So why now does this happen? Why now does somebody, and I agree with Bob, it's almost impossible for us to know directly how the chain of command, who did this, who gave the order, etc. But whoever wanted to kill him, and they did, there's no question. Why now? And I think when I go through that thought process, it helps me to understand why Navalny is more of a threat, or perceived as more of a threat, than he was even a few years ago. You know, the Kremlin has this, I would say, philosophical, ideological contradiction in terms, which is he's a CIA agent. He wants to create a color revolution. He wants to bring down the Putin government. And on the other hand, this dismissive quality that they've had, and especially President Putin, for quite a while, at least this year, you know, not using his name, calling him the patient, and kind of saying, who needs him? There was a quote, which is basically, who's he? Who needs him? So again, why now? I think that, and this is totally based, you know, we're all kind of shooting in the dark here, but from what I know about Russia, from what I know about people who are there now and who have talked about this, I think you have the confluence of a number of things that are happening in Russia. Certainly, the frustration that people have about the impunity and the lawlessness and the elites ripping off the system has only grown. You know, you've had, over the past year or so, year and a half, you've had a number of disparate protests in different areas of Russia, which had nothing to do with, you know, politics writ large, but they were, let's say, pollution or building a church in a park that people liked. I would call it kind of civic engagement, civil grassroots issues that people said, and this is not very scientific, but they basically said, I'm sick of this. I want some respect. You are just riding roughshod over my rights. So that was going on. Then you have some very specific issues that have popped up within the last year. There's no question that COVID has had an impact on the situation. The Russian government is perceived as alternately not handling it very well, although you could say that they actually handled it about as well as any other country. But that problem and the lockdowns that occurred because of COVID have been very unpopular. So COVID, I think, plays a role. And then I think also you now have an increase in food prices and a diminishing of incomes. So there are these very concrete everyday issues that are driving people to a certain amount of frustration. So getting back to the Kremlin, the Kremlin, as we all know, does a lot of polling that we never hear about, but they try to understand what is going on among the populace. And they would have to, if I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., and I know some of this, I presume they know that there is growing frustration. So if you put all these together, I think it helps to explain why the sensitivity and why they feel that they had to do what they are doing.
Konstantin, you're in the unusual position sitting in Moscow of talking to people who are Putin opponents, people who are in the Russian government, in the Russian business elite. What's your sense of how Russians are thinking about these issues when they think about Navalny, when they think about what the Kremlin is doing vis-a-vis the protests in Navalny, and what they think about corruption among the Russian elite?
Good evening. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk to you. So, what people think about Navalny and all these things, we do not know exactly, because we don't see any public opinion polls on these issues. But we could indirectly track the idea of what Kremlin wants to project on public mind through central television channels controlled by Kremlin, which raise every evening issue of Navalny being a puppet of Western countries, CIA or whatever special services against Russia. Putin repeated it several times. Once he even said that when they couldn't deny that he was followed by Russian security people, he said, if he has close ties with special services from the West, it is duty of the special services of Russia to follow him closely, to watch him closely. So, I mean, but speaking generally, I think that the last 6 months, Navalny topic was dominating the agenda, news agenda in Russia. It was since in August he was poisoned, everybody was talking about Navalny, and he was pushing all the issues which people would discuss: poisoning, FSB participation in this, Novichok as a prohibited chemical weapon used on the Russian territory. Then they suddenly encountered with what I call digital criminology, which took masks off a lot of people who were around Navalny, and appeared that Russian government was not prepared to this type of transparency through digital methods of investigation. Then this palace of Putin, and they realized that they can't lose agenda anymore, because the agenda is generated by Navalny, and they thought that if he doesn't come to Russia, he will be kind of an immigrant blogger like Khodorkovsky, and they made a very clear-cut warning on the 29th of December that if he arrives, he will be immediately arrested. So the puzzle now is why he returned, what caused him to return, because Putin, when you listen to him carefully, you understand that he puts to public all his major concern: concerns. And one of them was that he said that think about revolution in Russia, like in 1917. And I know that there is a lot of debate among top level officials about if Tsar or after Tsar government in Russia in 1917 decided to arrest and kill Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin with violation of human rights and political freedoms, would that be in the interest of Russia, which would avoid otherwise collectivization, gulag, repressions, and so on and so forth? And many people say, yes, they eliminated elite, church, and Tsar was a weak person. So I think that Putin, when now he mentioned last week talking to students about the harm of the revolution in Russia, he also means that they are going to go beyond the line which is drawn by the legislation if they think that Navalny's activity could bring Russia to a revolution. So, to make a short conclusion, the narrative has been changed by Putin. He doesn't want Navalny interfere with all his political technology into Duma election 21 and 24 presidential election, which are decisive for the next 10 years, 9 years until 1930. And most of the observers in this country believe that while he's in prison, he will be given more years of prison on other cases which were open against him. Money embezzlement from foundation of corruption struggle, and he did something humiliating the veteran or something like this. All these charges could be put and pile up years for him to be in prison.
Thank you. We're starting to get a number of questions from our audience. I wanted to remind our viewers that there is a question and answer icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So anybody that wants to submit a question, please use that icon. And then I will in turn pose those questions to our panelists. I'm going to summarize a number of questions that are coming in right now that are all focused on the question of where do these protests go and how threatening are they to Putin's rule and the Russian regime? There have been a lot of forecasts over the years with every round of protests that has occurred that this is it. You know, the Russian regime is on its last legs. Putin is in his last gasps of power. All of those forecasts, I think, at best were premature. Is this different? And what would you point to as an indicator that we should be monitoring that tells us something important is changing this time? Bob, could you start?
I do. I think, as Jill said, and as Konstantin knows better than any of the rest of us, there have been rolling protests over many, many issues over many years. But I think this is qualitatively different from what we've seen before. Not merely in the way it's been described or characterized by so many analysts. I mean, people have pointed out that the geographical scope of it is now fundamentally different. That it's all country. It's no longer focused on Khabarovsk or more often in the past, Moscow and St. Petersburg. Secondly, in its diversity, it really is not simply people who care about a given issue like the environment or people who are pro-Western liberal proponents of democracy in Russia, but it ranges from that group of liberals, Western-oriented, pro-democratic types, all the way over to very conservative nationalists with monarchists in between. So diversity, everybody's commented on that. But I think what makes this fundamentally different is that, as Jill summarized, this concatenation of issues now what they do all converge on is a single thing, not a particular ideology, not an issue like taxes on truckers or not being able to get secondhand automobiles from Japan, or Khabarovsk governor who's been ousted and imprisoned that was popularly elected, anything specific like that. What it now comes down to is essentially the issue of lawlessness plus corruption. And in effect, something that has now cut across what I believe, having listened to many of my colleagues and teachers in terms of analysts on the Russian side have been saying, if you think about Russia as basically 2/3 that might be called the masses, and they're often described as 2/3 of the population that is apathetic and inert, either because substantial portions of them support the regime, or for a larger part of them, perhaps, that believe that change is not possible. There's no real alternative to the current leadership. And also a widespread fear that if you do have substantial change, if somebody does come to power, a movement, or even someone like Navalny, they fear the instability from the change along the line. So that's 2/3. The other third are those that over time have included those organized opposition, a core of which has been Navalny and his people, but broader than that, people that are discontent with the situation. And what I think has happened in this case is that you've now bled between the two segments, the 1/3 and the 2/3, which then raises a very different question, which has not been raised by the other protests individually or even in some combination, and that is literally the legitimacy of the regime. It now begins to look parallel to what you see in Belarus, where if not a majority, then a very substantial portion of that population no longer regards the government as legitimate. And I think what's happened is, in terms of the question of timing, and to look at the points that Jill was making in a slightly different way, until now, until Navalny, until everything that has finally come to a head around this, President Putin was looking at Belarus from the outside, and Russia was a different situation. Now what he begins to fear is that there is an element of what's happening in Belarus that's happening in Russia because of that crossing between the 1/3 and the 2/3.
Very good. Jill, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would totally subscribe to what Bob is saying. And, in the past couple of days, I've been on a couple of calls, Zoom calls, of course, with members of Navalny's staff, senior members. And they have been asked, what happens next? And I have been struck by the fact that almost all of them, to a person, said, we know what we're going to do. We have a plan, we have a strategy. And yet when you try to say, yeah, but what's the final objective? Is Navalny like a political figure who wants to, putting it simply, who wants to become president? Or is it some sort of just bring down the Putin administration? What is the game plan? They're not that specific. And so as I think about this, I think what they want to do and what Navalny wants to do, and probably why he came back, because I do agree, abroad, he would not be, in Germany, he wouldn't be forgotten, but it would not be the same thing as coming back in this dramatic fashion and coming back to Russia. So what does he want to do? Judging by what the members of his staff have said, they want to ignite people. They want to consolidate what is now still a minority. They claim, according to one person I heard yesterday, between 10 and 12 million followers. They want to grow that. They are trying to grow it through techniques which are not saying, join the Navalny party. This is not a party, this is a movement. And they're using that technique that I think a number of us have heard about, which is called smart voting. So when they, let's say on a regional level, if there are three candidates. One of them is from Putin's party, United Russia, the party of power, and the other might be a communist, and the other might be, somebody else. The Navalny people will look at those candidates and say, we don't care if that candidate is a communist. He or she is best placed to defeat the party of power candidate. So they're reaching out to people who might not look at all like allies, but they want to grow that movement. And again, quoting one other person whom I heard yesterday, they feel that they can have, by the inspiration of Navalny, they can have other people who come forward who are future Navalnys. This again may be aspirational, but I think that appears to be the strategy.
Konstantin, I'm going to ask this question to you in a slightly different way. Do you think that cohesion within Russia's elite class is the critical factor in ensuring the regime navigates its way through this challenge from Navalny and this very broad-based opposition movement?
The unity of elite is an important question, but there are some other important issues as well, because in 1917 and in 1991, the Russian and Soviet empire went down when two factors were evident. The currency stopped to be a good currency. Wooden ruble were called in 1991, and kerenki were called in 1917, meaning worthless money. And number two, the resolute decision of the power to use brutal force against protesters. As soon as this desire to use brutal force weakens, immediately things begin to develop. 2011, 2012, Medvedev, the then president, very clearly sent a message to internal minister that we don't use the force against protesters. And we had those Bolotnaya, and then we had Sakharova, a lot of people, because people, when they're not afraid that they will be beaten, they go out. So I think those two factors are very important. A good ruble and resolute decision to use the force. They're still present, and more than that, they're demonstratively shown, particularly yesterday, for example. They were much more harsh than in two previous days of demonstrators. And one thing which I think maybe for all of you to think fundamental, when Biden won the election, in Kremlin, everybody decided that that very person came to power who in 2011 told face-to-face Putin, please leave, Vladimir. We are not going to support you. And now when you talk to people in Kremlin, that they know that agenda for Biden, Russia without Putin, didn't change. And simultaneously, the agenda of protesters also was reduced to only one sentence, Russia without Putin. And they understand that this is kind of interconnected. The West doesn't want Putin, so Putin doesn't want to leave because somebody wants him to leave. And I think that the whole thing is being changed now in order to live under sanctions, under unfair, as they think, pressure from the West on Russian internal policy. And there is no objective media. It is a very strict party line. One part of media says that Navalny is like a god. The other says saying the same about Putin. And when you talk to these people, you understand that for revolutionary community, there is no difference between revolutionary community and the real life. But for real life, there is a difference. And those people who think that so many people are involved in this political turmoil from my point of view, are mistaken, because if you go to bars, to restaurants, to sports arena, because everything is open in Moscow, and since we have this vaccine with my wife, we attend intensively all these things in the end of December. People hear about this, they might be sympathetic, but the life for them continues on their own idea to get some money. And the economic issue is the most serious political factor for Putin. If he doesn't have economic growth, which he doesn't have for 7-8 years, he will have problems. And he will have more problems because of that than because of someone's political activity.
We're having a number of questions coming in asking about how effective Navalny can be as an anti-corruption and opposition leader while he's in jail. One from USA Today, one from former ambassador to Russia, Alexander Vershbow. What are the prospects that Navalny can be, to pick an analogy here, a Nelson Mandela, who can lead an effective opposition movement while in prison? Is this something that's likely going to be a significant obstacle, or can he turn this to his advantage? Bob?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. He has not been going into this of the same stature or the same significance within his society that Mandela was in South Africa. He has become something very different from what he was before he returned to Russia, because now he is a moral symbol. He's not merely a spokesman for opposition to corruption and change within Russia. You get then to very practical issues of whether in this new information age, there are still ways by which he can operate, communicate effectively when he's incarcerated. My assumption is the penal colony, the sentence of the penal colony will be done in a way to prevent any kind of significant communication. So then the question is whether there are lieutenants or others within his movement, maybe even as a result of some indirect communication, that can continue the activity. But again, I have no way of judging that. I suspect Konstantin, with the people he knows and the contacts, is a much better judge of what he can do. But I do believe, as we've been saying, that a threshold has been crossed. And while I agree entirely with Konstantin's proposition that the make weight for this will be when economic fortunes continue to deteriorate in the public in general, all the people he sees at theater and in stadiums are now fundamentally discontent with life's conditions, that will then merge with the issue that I said has produced a qualitative change, and that is a broad sense of injustice, the innards of which is lawlessness and corruption. So those two things have to come together, and the question is whether the phenomena itself, in the context of some effort on the part of Navalny's organization, perhaps in some fashion led, as much as the administration will attempt to disrupt it, can make this going forward. But after that, whether windy response, I end where I started. I just don't know.
Jill?
Yeah, it's very interesting to think that Navalny, in the past couple of days, has been able to communicate from a jail cell, from a courtroom. He's a master communicator. Even his closing argument to the judge was basically, this cri de coeur, which is all over the internet right now. You can see the video, you can read the transcript, etc. So once he gets to the penal camp, does he have the means? And I think that's, we were just talking about that with Bob. Does he have the means to communicate? We don't know. Presumably they will take his cell phone away. However, watching Navalny, I would have to think that they knew he could end up in a prison camp. So it could be that they have certain communications already loaded and ready to be released at certain times. It could be that they dole it out, 6 months from now, they may have another expose that can be done by his team. So I do think he'll be weakened, no question, when he is in a camp. We presume he will physically be there. But I do think his team will continue to communicate. But the other side of this is they are now, as Bob referenced, they're taking kind of the Belarusian model to have people go into the streets every week. So essentially, every weekend, there will be protests. And that, I think, has a number of different purposes, obviously to show support, but the authorities have been able to shut down Moscow and make it very, very difficult for anyone to get on the streets. However, the brutality that Konstantin was talking about is in its own right a type of propaganda for, and I mean that, directly, just propaganda for Navalny. To see heads cracked, to see a person hit with a baton is a very, very powerful image. And I think that sadly, that's another thing that they are going to use. And I do think that is going to be effective because it is so brutal. And it seems, as some young people have said, so very unfair. And that's a very difficult thing for the Kremlin to control because every 19-year-old with a phone can have a video of themselves being arrested or somebody being beaten. So that grassroots type of propaganda will continue. And he does have a very well organized staff that know how to do communication.
Konstantin, that those images of violence by Russian authorities against protesters, obviously that sort of image resonates a lot in the West and sparks a lot of outrage. Does it also spark that kind of outrage in Russia?
As I told you, the media is split. In that part of media which is liberal, it generates a storm of indignation. On the official media, it generates a new wave of proudness for their internal police, which is being attacked by gangsters who are ruthless and everything. So they show the same pictures, but give them a different interpretation. And I think that the game changer in this, our internal political life, happened after Navalny began to attack Putin in person. He didn't do that for many years. He would attack corruption and unfairness and injustice in general, showing a lot of examples. But now he accuses him in person that he wanted to kill him, to poison him, and now he showed allegedly his palace and that he is not modest. He is breaking his reputation of being shy, modest, street like simple guy from St. Petersburg who doesn't care about expensive stuff. So, and I think elections, today the chairman of election committee said that they will have 3 days voting in September. During 3 days, impossible to arrange proper observation, impossible. 3 days is 3 days. You can't control at night, who keeps all these ballots and everything. So one factor. Another, when Navalny began attack on Putin, immediately in Duma, 3 leaders of communists, Zhirinovsky and Fair Russia, came out to microphones and said, Navalny is the enemy of the people. So now when we talk about what Jill mentioned, smart voting, that vote for anyone but United Russia, that means that you could vote for communist or Zhirinovsky or whatever candidate who think that Navalny is the enemy of the people, a traitor. And I think that this technology should be corrected because not those people may happen to be even worse than United Russia, because they're cynical, you know, they get those votes, but without any formal obligation, because nobody debates with them. They simply say, vote for him, and nobody meets him. Nobody just makes a bargain. We vote for you, but you do in legislation this or that. So I don't think that this method in that form, which we knew it before, could be efficient in September.
George, could I just jump in for very quickly?
Please.
On this issue of the violence, I think it's quite notable that over the past couple of days, since these protests have been taking place, on Russian TV and on the internet, and I've watched some of these, the government-controlled, state-controlled media are showing video clips of policemen being really nice guys, helping young people to get out of the way of the protests. There was a video I watched last night, a little clip, kind of like an Instagram type thing. I think it was on Telegram. And it was a policeman in the ninja outfit and a young girl who had completely lost it emotionally. And the policeman says, come on, let's go home. I'm going to take you out of here. You should go home. So there are many of these, they're very deliberate, which I think is meant to undermine that idea that the police are brutal, that they are actually helping citizens, to protect citizens against terrible, chaotic violence.
I think that's an excellent point, Jill. Thank you. I would like to shift now to another category of questions, and we have many of these coming in right now that are asking broadly about what's at stake here for the United States and what should the United States do about all of this. Trudy Rubin of the Philadelphia Inquirer asks, Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation has called for US sanctions against Putin's cronies and lists them specifically. What kind of impact might that have? Kelly Vlahos from the Quincy Institute asks whether the Biden administration's desire to do something about the protest crackdowns and Navalny's attention might risk getting the US sucked into some kind of unnecessary conflict with Putin. So what do you all think about this question of what the United States ought to do and what's at stake for us in all of this? Bob?
Well, I think it's a complicated question, and it goes to the heart of what has been the essential tools of US policy for dealing with Russia for the last 6 or 7 years now, particularly in the context of the Ukrainian crisis back to 2014, sanctions as the primary tool, the supplementary tool being the pillory. I think one starts by saying that not simply out of moral indignation, but condemnation of what's happened in this case is justified because, in effect, you've already had a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights that what has been done to Navalny, the original charge, and the so-called fraud charge, was politically motivated and it was unjustified. And if Russia, which is a member of the Court of Human Rights, is prepared to listen to those things, then it has, or is still part of it, then it has violated that, and the condemnation of what they've done in that context is justified. Certainly, the poisoning issue is one that deserves condemnation. But then you get to the question of, and that you've had the condemnation already in the formal statements from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. That's largely along these lines, condemning both the treatment of Navalny and then the treatment of the protesters themselves in the protests. But then the question is, what more do you do? And I would start by noting that in terms of US retaliation, including the issue of sanctions, the agenda is now is rather full. President Putin has charged Avril Haines, the new director of national intelligence, to look into 4 different things. Look into the hacking of infrastructure that occurred recently. Secondly, to look at the poisoning issue, which is in some ways related to the original question of poisoning of Skripal and the US response and the sanctions under the CBM legislation or the Convention on Chemical Weapons. Third, the bounties issue, the so-called alleged payment of bounties to kill American soldiers and personnel in Afghanistan. President Biden himself has suggested that if he is persuaded by the intelligence reports that there was the election the hacking and the election interference, but above all else, the hacking that was of the infrastructure, he's prepared to respond with further sanctions. That then leads me to a basic point. The United States at this stage has layered so many sanctions around so many issues that they've become almost ineffective, if not counterproductive. We really do need to begin setting priorities of what we wish to accomplish with sanctions. And then secondly, to think about what kinds of conditionality, including positive conditionality, is likely to have the most effect with the Russian leadership that at this point, I think probably doesn't know how or what to respond to in terms of the cascade of sanctions. And in this context, as was mentioned earlier, George, I think you noted it, the Navalny supporters have asked the 35 individuals they've identified now be sanctioned further. My assumption is that that's not likely to be effective, not the least because of the context in terms of the regime, in terms of Putin and his people. As Konstantin pointed out, they now have a very negative picture that they've put together, that going back to the 2011 Biden visit to Moscow, where he discouraged Putin from returning to the presidency, to Navalny, who wants to remove him as president. In this context, the notion that sanctions would have any kind of effect on government officials, let alone up to Putin, seems to me pointless. Would they be a morale boost for the movement itself? Perhaps. But here I come back to two further points. One, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy of the European Union, Josep Borrell, is scheduled to arrive in Moscow, I think this week or next week. And I think it'll be important for us to keep ourselves in tandem with the Europeans and how we're responding to this. So I think we want to pay attention to how the Europeans are judging this issue. But I would hope that both Europe and the United States would, in thinking about the way they respond in this specific context, apply the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Be very careful about what you do in a way that doesn't make things worse.
Jill?
Well, you know, I would say this is a new administration, and it's a time that I think some new thinking is important. And I absolutely agree with Bob that you cannot just jump into this with the kind of the old paradigm that this is the Soviet Union and Navalny is Andrei Sakharov and he's a dissident and we have to do this or that. I think that that would be a complete misunderstanding of what is going on in Russia. And I also agree that sanctions, you know, are taken off the shelf every day for everything. And the Russians at this point, at least the leadership, really look at those. Number one, they have concluded that sanctions essentially will never be lifted. And so they must continue regardless of whether there are sanctions. They pride themselves on the fact that they've gotten this far without collapse in spite of a number of sanctions. So I wouldn't just, you know, grab another sanction. And I wouldn't get sucked into a very complex situation of who's a friend of Putin, if we squeeze him, what will it do? It's very unclear how that would work. That said, I do think the statements have been very good. You absolutely have to support, you know, actually, I would say you have to criticize the malfeasance and the lack of due process, et cetera. I think that is very, very important. And I also would say coordinate with the Europeans. But I do think, getting back to that essential point, that it's kind of a different ball game. You know, over I guess you could say, going back to like 2011, 2012, the Bolotnaya demonstrations, that I think Russia is changing. And I do think that there is a lot of grassroots activity, not just among young people, although they are an important part of this. But I do think that there are people who are involved civically on the grassroots more than they ever have before. I'm not trying to be Pollyannish to say that this is, you know, the shoots of democracy, et cetera, although I do believe that that's part of it. I really do believe that Russians are beginning to build their own democracy. And so I think this idea that the United States can kind of parachute in, or shame them into doing something, or tell them how to run their democracy, could backfire. I will tell you, you know, I'm teaching a course at Georgetown in what I call the Putin generation. These young people who are 20 and less, who've grown up with no leader other than Putin. And many of them are patriotic. They may really, you know, hate Putin, or just think he's an old guy who has nothing to say. But they tend to be quite patriotic about Russia. So we have to bear that in mind. And I think taking a very nuanced and deft approach is very important.
Konstantin, I want to ask you something that Jill just raised here when she noted that sometimes what we do can backfire. We oftentimes will adopt policy positions in the expectation that Russia will behave in a certain way, only to find out that Russia's reaction is not at all what we anticipated. Are there ways that you could envision that the United States could do things regarding Navalny and the protest movement that could in fact backfire or be counterproductive? And what might those be?
It's difficult for me to judge. One thing for me is clear. Navalny factor now is becoming a reality in Russian bilateral and multilateral relations. We didn't have that factor. Navalny existed, problems with corruption existed, but he wasn't a factor of international relations. Now, every day, foreign ministers of different countries make statements addressing to our foreign ministry, and our foreign ministry every day makes 5, 6 statements demanding not to interfere into Russian affairs. So I don't know how this Navalny factor, which for at least 6 months, I think, will be really on the agenda of Russia's bilateral and multilateral relations, how it will be transformed into policy measures. Sanctions, now I heard people who were in this list, latest list mentioned by Navalny supporters, they want to develop sanction mechanism in Russia, because what they point out that the mechanism of sanctioning Russians is not based on the court ruling. So it's political decision. He is a friend of Putin or close to Putin, let's punish him. So they now, at least they work a document to propose to Duma so that Russian sanction mechanism will identify somebody as an enemy of Russia or Putin. And if he is a friend or cooperating with him, let's sanction by arresting his property, apartments, whatever they could find, and that could be to Navalny supporters who are now in immigration or whatever. So I think they want to build now a mirror type response and to show to people that if sanctions against us are not based on the legal basis or court ruling or due process of inviting people who are accused to defend themselves, why should we look at those people who fight against legitimate President Putin otherwise? So I expect that the relations between Russia and the West in the forthcoming months will be deteriorating. It will be very ideological, and with this ideological fortress-style mentality, the September election will take place. which will give Putin more than 75%, I think, of Duma mandates, so that he would have control over constitutional right of parliament in 2024. This is very important for him, that 2024 election is not intervened by parliament with any changes in the legislation. That's why they put this 2/3 of Duma, but now I think it will be even more, 75%, three-fourths of Duma will be for Putin. So that is, and after that, when they get control of the next 3 years and transition to 2024, whoever is on the transition route, they could begin to look around and see some compromises. But until September, nothing will happen.
We're coming close to the end of our discussion, but I want to wrap this up by putting forward for your reaction something that Fritz Ermarth has sent in. Fritz is the former chairman of the National Intelligence Council, an experienced Soviet and Russia hand and intelligence officer. And he observes that, that Putin is an autocrat, but he doesn't have total control and authority. In some ways, he's the captive as well as the leader of the regime. He has the most power and authority, but there is a lot of power and authority in other elements of the regime that can do things independent of Putin that they think he wants or that they think he should do. Now, what this means, he says, is that Putin can't simply reform the system. He's got to bring along other elements such as the security services, the military, the business elite, what he calls the oligarchs. What do you think of this particular picture, and what implications might it have for how the United States should approach this churn that's going on in Russia right now? Bob, can I start with you?
Happy to do so, and particularly in responding to my old friend Fritz. I think he's described the situation very accurately. This has been done in detail by Yelena Litneva, the fine scholar formerly from the Soviet Union, now in London, who's done a lot of work on so-called network theory. And the short conclusion that she reaches that the system is a honeycomb, both vertically and horizontally, of these networks. And at the top of it, Putin commands, as Fritz suggests, but as he said, he is as much a prisoner or a captive of the system as he is its pilot or creator. And I think that's right. And therefore, the question that Fritz puts is, what would be necessary in order to reform the system? Can Putin, powerful as he is, do that? And what should be US policy based on the judgment you make around that? My own response would be that I don't think that President Putin and those who are close to him can get outside their skins, can stand outside the system and look at it in those terms. I think the other element of being prisoner of the system, that is the limitation of his ability to reform it, is the limitation on his willingness to even think about reforming it. The extent to which he and those around him have made themselves dependent on that system. And I think that's the fundamental obstacle. And therefore, although, as Fritz and others on this call would know, the history of change in Russia comes from above, it rarely comes from below, other than extraordinary circumstances. I think we are in a circumstance now where if change is going to occur in Russia, it is going to have to be as a result of this this convergence of forces, and the drivers for it, I believe, as we were saying earlier, will be the economic future of Russia, as Konstantin outlined it for the average person, whether it continues to go downhill, combined with this sense of growing injustice, the core of which is growing lawlessness and growing corruption. And that process, I don't want to call it an organic process, but that process within Russia is what we on the outside need to watch. It's not something that we can engineer. It's not something that we can control.
Jill?
As soon as I heard that word reform, I thought, I kind of shuddered because I don't think that President Putin actually is interested in reform. I think he's interested in keeping things stable, making sure things don't fall apart, making sure that the system as it is continues in power. And I think that's his dilemma, because the only way that ultimately Russia can become, a modern, influential, other than nuclear weapons, et cetera, but a modern country is to do the type of reform that is really antithetical to his rule. He would have to loosen some controls. He would have to allow people to do things, start businesses, get the type of education that they want, stand up for their rights. That is very, very difficult for him to do, if not impossible. It would hurt him. It could bring him down. So I don't see any particular motivation for reform. But I do agree that he is part of this odd, conglomeration of forces. Everybody is in it together. And if that system goes down, a lot of people get hurt, whether they understand or even want a modern Russia or not. I just don't see any type of reform at this point, especially now, where things have become so, there's this Russian обострённая, so extremely extreme, let's say. Anyway, that's, who knows, George, but that's I think where we are with President Putin.
Okay. Konstantin, what's your perspective on this question?
Yeah, two things. On manipulation of Putin, I think that it is a good observation that he is both captive and looks like a leader. And this is a technology how to manipulate the people. Everybody knows that you can't go and directly put anything in front of him. I heard several times from people who played hockey with him, when they raised the questions while playing hockey of substantial matter, he would look at you and say, you will never be playing again if you raise questions. We just play hockey. So people know that you can't address him because he is afraid of this influence. But people develop this technology. You touch his friend, or you send somebody to dance in the church, then law on the hurt feelings will be passed, and then you begin to use the law on hurt feelings on other spheres. So you push him to the right, conservative, and sometimes a reactionary field of our public life through manipulation, not directly, but as if Skripals were attacked by him. No, but he begins to protect his people because of unfounded accusations. And the economic thing, very important, about the limits of his transformation potential. To transform Russian economy means to create independent centers for accumulating capital, growth, wealth, and value. As soon as people begin to accumulate independently wealth because of the model of development, they might have political preferences, which they can't allow. So the basic sources of income are concentrated in state or para-state organizations, so that only they could finance political activity. And even though they might talk about the reforms, the critical thing is just to let people work freely, and immediately you'll have new millionaires and billionaires, and nobody knows what will be their political. So they control their income, and by that they ruin their own base, because 7-8 years with real income falling, he loses his constituency.
Well, thank you all. I think we've come to the end of our discussion. We've covered a wide range of topics, very complex topics, I think, with a great deal of nuance and insight. So thank you all for participating in this. Thank you to our audience for an excellent set of questions. We'll look forward to following this evolving story over time and to our next event. Thank you.